Today on In Good Faith, I'm very happy to be speaking with Dr. Amy Jill Levine and AJ.
Better
Thank you
you
for
call
making
me
time.
AJ. Delighted to
For,
be with you.
and you are so kind. I know that you've flown Oslo to London, London to the States, and here you are trying to stay awake so you can get back on the US clock.
Yeah, I think I've been awake for a little over 24 hours. I don't sleep well on planes, and now I'm sort of running on fumes. So trust me to be articulate. I'll do my best.
I don't think sleep on planes actually counts as sleep. So, AJ is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. And we're going to link to a bio in our show notes because I really could go on for pages. I mean, you're a busy person and you keep your nose to the grindstone, evidently,
But I'm
because
also really old, and I've been doing this a very long time.
come on, I was giving you an out.
Thank
But
you.
she's been awarded grants from the Mellon Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, various audiences with Pope Francis. And in spring 2019, the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. She's a member of the Wolf Institute, a Center for Jewish Christian Relations at Cambridge. And we've had some of their leadership as guests on our show and love the work that they do.
Excellent.
So
Good to
I
know.
I have to start with one question that you just must have a boilerplate answer for this, which is you're Jewish
Yeah.
and you're writing about the New Testament. In fact, the book that I'm referring to today, the latest sort of impetus, is The Gospel of John, A Beginner's Guide to the Way, the Truth, and the Life. How do you come to so much focus on the New Testament and the Old Testament together from your tradition?
Well, because it's my tradition, right? So if you're doing the New Testament, basically you're doing Jewish history.
Mhm.
If you're looking at Jesus of Nazareth, you're looking at a first century Jew who interacts with a lot of other first century Jews. If you're looking at Paul, you're looking at a first century Jew who's trying to promote a Jewish message, but to a bunch of people who aren't Jews. So the New Testament is in fact Jewish history, but it's not a history that the Jewish community has preserved. So I have to go to Christian history to figure out part of my own background. And at the same time, because I've spent a lot of time, again, I'm old, a lot of time dealing with Christians of a variety of different
Mhm.
suasions, I find that far too often, and one example is too often, unfortunate, negative, and false stereotypes of Judaism get imposed onto the Jesus tradition or get imposed onto the Paul tradition. So, what happens on Sunday morning or in an evening Bible study is that anti Semitism is either being introduced or it's being reinforced,
Mhm.
not because the teachers and the preachers and the prophets or whoever are anti-Semites. I don't think most of them are. I mean, some of them probably are, right? But for the most part, probably not. It's because of ignorance. And unless we do the history, bad stuff is going to enter in, and bad stuff means we're going to misunderstand Jesus. We're going to misunderstand Paul. We're going to misunderstand the Gospels, and everything's going to go sideways. So, in doing what I do, I can recover my own Jewish history and I can prevent anti Semitism. And those strike me as two fairly valuable
Yes.
options.
This is worth some dedication.
Yeah.
You know, you draw some beautiful parallels. Even just in the introduction to this book, you talk about the Bible beginning. In the beginning,
In the
there
beginning.
was, and as well as the book of John saying in the beginning was the Word. And I love what you said about this. Tells us like hear this again.
Yeah.
Kind
I
of
mean,
start over, erase, start with a clean slate.
well, John's not starting from scratch, right?
No, no, but
um, so if we begin the New Testament by avoiding all the stuff that came before, that's actually a Christian heresy called Marcionism. If we dismiss the Old Testament as simply propedeutic or simply like, here's the first draft, and once we get Jesus, we can throw away the first draft because now we've got the final copy. That doesn't work either. So what John is doing is echoing the earlier text and saying, this is a new type of Genesis. It's a new way of seeing how the world took shape. It's a new way of being in the world. So in the same way that we can use, to use Christian terminology, we can use the Old Testament to help us better understand the New Testament. We can also use the New Testament to go back and then see the Old Testament in a different way. And I think both directions are valuable.
Yeah. Well, I felt called when you phrased it that way to just sit back and say, let go of some preconceptions and be able to hear this coming out, the
Yeah.
Jewish tradition
Or
continuing
or
through.
hang on to some of those preconceptions because they may be right.
Oh, okay.
I mean, don't dump everything. What's that old line about? You don't want your mind to be so open that your brains fall out. So some of those preconceptions may actually be extremely helpful. I'm presuming actually your church taught you some pretty good stuff. So hang on to them, but allow them to be challenged. And generally, what I do in working with Christians who have a high Christology or a sense of divine inspiration of the text is to say, hang on to the beliefs that you have. If you believe Jesus is Lord and Savior and He was there at creation, hang on to that because that's what John says. But that's not all these texts mean.
Hmm.
So let's see how, if we know more about the Old Testament, if we know how about John is echoing the Old Testament, and if we can add to that how John is echoing Second Temple Jewish ideas or early rabbinic ideas, which just makes things even more wonderful, then what you can do is correct misconceptions, but you can also add to and enrich those good preconceptions that you've already got.
So you have this mix of language and scholarship and culture. Let me step back personally just a little bit to say, what took you down this path? And for instance, if you look at yourself today, would 12-year-old AJ have been surprised to see what you do today? Or was this already happening in you?
There are little kids who like to play doctor. I mean, however that plays out, or they want my daughter, who's actually in hotel management. When her friends would come over, she would check them in and ask them if they had towels and if they needed shampoo. She now works for a hotel management company, so that seemed to have worked. I like to play school. I had a pretend blackboard back, or real blackboard. When people had blackboards, they actually wrote on with chalk and had
Hmm.
erasers. And I would teach my friends the ABCs. So I always knew that I was going to be a teacher of some sort. For a while, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be the first on the Supreme Court, but then Sandra Day O'Connor came, and that was the end of that wish. Um, it, Even by the time I was 12 years old, and then at that point, I would have become bat mitzvah in the synagogue. So
Hmm.
you're studying. And I loved the stuff that I was studying. I loved what I was learning in Hebrew school. I loved the Hebrew language. I like language. I particularly like dead languages because you don't have to talk to anybody in them. And then you don't have to worry about what kind of verb form you're using or whether the noun agrees with the adjective and gender. So I love dead languages. That's great. And you don't have to worry about accents. But I was also very well aware since well before the time I was 12 that there's Christian anti-Semitism up there. Of Jews killing Jesus or whatever. Most of
Yeah.
that's gone away, except in some certain fundamentalist circles. But there's still lots of negative stuff out there, and I wanted to be able to correct that. So I had the fascination with my own religious tradition. I was fascinated with what my friends were growing up with, and I grew up in a Roman Catholic neighborhood. I was hurt by and puzzled by the anti-Semitism that I experienced. So by the time I was 12, all of this stuff was more or less coalescing. My mother wanted me to go to law school. So I figured I'll study this stuff and I'll keep studying it. And if none of that works, I'm going to go to law school. And it's like, now I'm on Social Security. I'm not going to law school. Um, but that interest in the history, the stories, the different stories told about the same events,
Hmm.
so we have two different creation narratives in the book of Genesis. We have different versions of the Deuteronomic history, the David story, the one told in Second Samuel and First Kings, and the one told in First and Second Chronicles. So I'm aware that stories can be told differently. Well, there are four Gospels. Well, that's terrific. So what I was able to do in the book on John is to say, well, here are some of our presuppositions, to use your
Hmm.
language, that we may have had from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, now let's look at John and what do we see that we might not have seen, or how might we add to this? So the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "You're the light of the world." I think that's terrific. And John, he says, "I'm the light of the world." Well, these are not mutually exclusive, but they're very different emphases. So what happens not only when we read John in light of the Old Testament, but what happens when we read John in light of the Synoptics?
I am so curious, when you were teaching, particularly Christians, What are they surprised to learn about the connections and the Old Testament and how that Jewish culture is carrying through? I mean, just the fact, as you said, that Jesus lived as a Jew in Jewish culture, is that the first surprise?
Some of them, well, most of them agree that Jesus was Jewish, like at least on his mother's side. I was worried about Christology on the other part. What they don't get is what that means.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's like saying somebody is a Latter-day Saint. Then what are the stereotypes that you put in? Somebody's Catholic. What are the stereotypes you put in? Somebody's from the American South as opposed to from New England or California. And then we realize we've got all sorts of stereotypes, some of which are absolutely on target, spot on, and some of which are totally nutso. So what I need to do is explain what this Jewish culture is, and then all that negative stuff starts surfacing. And a lot of that negative stuff comes from an uninformed reading of the Gospels or an uninformed reading of the Old Testament. So if we begin with the idea that Old Testament means law and New Testament means grace, we're wrong from the get-go. Because there's wads of grace. I'm not sure what the collective for grace is. There's like huge amounts of grace in the Old Testament. And there's a fair amount of instruction in the New Testament, right? From Jesus to Paul to the book of Revelation to the Catholic epistles and so on. If we begin with the idea that Jews worship a God of anger and wrath and Christians worship a God of love, I just kind of point to things like, the book of Revelation, which is not God on a good day. So we've got harsh stuff in both texts. Woe to you, Capernaum, damning an entire city. So to try to break off some of those stereotypes, I find that a number of my Christian students think that Jews are totally obsessed with like purity concerns, and Jesus like does away with all that purity stuff. Nonsense. Jesus restores people to states of ritual purity. He doesn't do away with the purity laws. And that's very important when we look at church traditions that do have certain purity laws in terms of dress or diet or ritual immersion, right?
Yeah.
So if we start thinking, well, Jesus does away with all those rituals, then that winds up creating a sense of, well, any church today that engages in ritual is somehow contrary to Jesus rather than is consistent with Jesus. So I spend a lot of time correcting misconceptions.
Even just seeing a mikvah has to tell you, there's this whole existing history about ritual cleansing in water. It was not invented by John the Baptist.
No.
It goes back in
not
history.
At all. Actually, there is some beautiful mikvah, that's the plural, in synagogues. There's a gorgeous mikvah in Nashville. So you can look at the old fashioned, like the ones from 2,000 years ago, because we've got lots of there are lots of them that we found in terms of archaeology. But today, like the water's heated and you got like mood lighting and a couch. It's like a really nice place to go for brides before they get married, for example, or mikvah today being used by some Jews, both men and women. But I know Orthodox Jewish women who, following surgery, particularly something like a mastectomy, have gone to the mikveh because it's a sense of rebirth or a different form of purification. So the importance of ritual continues, but it takes on new meaning as we go through the centuries.
Oh, that's beautiful. Because you have a firm foot in scholarship, how does that work for you? Is your personal faith at a slightly compartmentalized? Is it a Venn diagram that's a huge overlap? How does that work for you as both a scholar and as a person who has a faith life?
Yeah, but you're presuming I have a faith life, and then we have to figure out what that means.
I've done that. Yeah, I presume that.
And I guess I sort of do. It depends upon how you define things. I have a lot of friends who describe themselves as, I'm spiritual but not religious, which means they don't like going to church. Right. Or mosque or synagogue, but somehow they feel that they've got some connection to a transcendent reality or to God as they understand God. And they have certain rituals in which they engage, whether a modified version of what they would have learned in childhood in a religious community or something that they just invented. So I have my spiritual but not religious friends. I'm religious but not spiritual. I really like ritual. I think ritual is fantastic. And In terms of my own ritual life, so if I were to light candles on Friday night, which is a home-based thing, not a synagogue-based
Mm-hmm.
thing,
Yeah.
I use my mother's candlesticks.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up with my grandmother, so I remember my grandmother saying the blessing. I remember my mother saying the blessing, and the rituals give me this connection. Um, so the rituals to me are substantially sustaining, and my ritual life tends to be less a transcendent God-oriented thing, like a me and up there something,
Right.
and more of a me community, me family, me culture. It's a grounding.
Mm.
So I'm less interested in what people would call faith, and I don't think I was ever interested in like that faith stuff. That was too complicated. Right? Theology is complicated. Theology is above my pay grade. But I'm interested in being a better ethical person, and Judaism has a very, very strong ethical tradition. So I look to that. It informs me when I have questions. I can go to Jewish sources like the Talmud or like the medieval response. Jews are still developing what we think, right? Because we don't stop. It's not like we stopped at the end of the Old Testament. Um, so I use that tradition to help figure out, well, how do I do this better? How do I respond to that in a more compassionate and more informed way? So my faith life is ritual and ethics and community with a little sprinkling of theology, but that's not really where I'm focused.
Mm. I'm thinking of, you just mentioned a beautiful ritual of the candles on beginning of Shabbat, Friday night, and how lovely to have your grandmother's candlesticks. Um, any other particular rituals or even personal rituals you've come up with that you observe that are meaningful to you?
Um, I It's an interesting question. I don't think anybody's asked me that. Do I have personal rituals? Well, I do like walking on my treadmill,
Mm-hmm.
for which I am now watching for the third time through all of the episodes of Midsummer Murders, which is this British show set in a kind of a faux Cotswolds, where I think half the population of Great Britain has now been murdered. And the nice thing is that I remember all the characters, but I can never remember who did it. So I work very, very hard, and I work fairly consistently. So one good thing is I have a dog, and the
Mm-hmm.
dog forces me to stop working because when the dog needs to be walked, the dog needs to be walked. And the dog does not understand, excuse me, I have to finish the paragraph. Um, Walking on the treadmill helps me with that because it says you cannot sit in front of your computer for 8 hours at a stretch, only getting up to do things like get another glass of water or brush my teeth. Um, so what I try to do is make sure that my life remains balanced.
Mm.
And if it's all work, then I become a terrible person. And if it's all play, then I become neurotic because I'm not getting my stuff done. I also knit. So I'm sitting here at my desk, and if I just lean over, it's like here's yarn, right? Because
Wow.
it's here. So I have swatches over here and patterns and yarn. And when I'm too tired to do anything more, and I've done my treadmill thing, and I have my handy Fitbit on to make sure that I do it, I knit.
Is that a meditation?
It's a relaxation that makes me
Ah,
feel like I'm not quite wasting my time.
yeah.
Because if I just sat in front of the TV or just listened to music, then I would be wasting my time. I mean, like I'm energetic and I need to be doing something.
Yeah.
Knitting makes me feel like I'm doing something. So I have a graduate student who just had a baby. I make a blanket. My son got engaged. I made them matching fisherman sweaters. My daughter found this beautiful yarn. Could I make her a scarf? Yes, dear, I can do that.
As a fellow dog owner who has not missed a day of walking in 4 years, much to my surprise,
Good for you.
I relate to that. In this book about John, you talk about festivity in worship, and I'm wondering whether it's traditions from the Old or the New Testament. What can we apply now to have that kind of festivity, whether in our rituals or what do you
Um,
think?
John chapter 2 is the story of the wedding at Cana.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons John put that in there is because if you just looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you would get the impression that Jesus was not a great fan of getting married. Right. Oh, we'll be
Hmm.
like the angels in heaven who neither marry. Just like that seems pretty good, but then what happens to marriage? Or concerns about being eunuch, so non-reproductive, and therefore
Hmm.
not having biological children, non-reproductive members of this kingdom of heaven. And I think John wanted to say, no, Jesus thinks he's going to cater a wedding, so that's fine. Marriage is fine. So you can go the single route, you could go the married route. It's good. But it also suggests to me, and I think this is consistent with the synoptics as well, that to be in the presence of Jesus is to be with a bridegroom. And that
Hmm.
bridegroom language is all through the synoptics. And it's also very, very strong right in the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist identifies Jesus as the bridegroom. Right? So what is it? You go into church, it's like you're at a wedding. And what is that? It's a sense of a new family coming together. It's a sense of celebration. It's a sense of unity with diversity still preserved. It's a sense of, things are going to be even more interesting when the ceremony is over and the couple retired to do what couples normally do. And it's not just opening presents. So it's a sense of it's like there's this new life to come and there's joy and there's an openness and a hope for the future. So if your first major miracle is catering a wedding and celebrating that wedding, I think that's terrific. It also reminds me, because I've been to a number of weddings, including my own, that it's not all about the bride and groom. It's also about the guests. There are other people there. So you do away with bridezilla and groomzilla. And you pay attention to hospitality.
Hmm.
There's also the joy in being able to say what you think and being able to laugh, because I think there's a lot in John that's really funny. So when Jesus' mom, who's never called Mary in the Gospel of John, she comes up to him and she says, hey, they ran out of wine. Well, so that's the way first century people speak. In fact, that's the way people in my family speak. So if I say to my son, your sister's birthday is in 2 weeks, I am not simply conveying information. I'm saying, get with the program and at least send her an e-card, right? Do
Hmm.
something. If my husband says to me, we're out of milk, the response he wants is not, oh, that's interesting. The response he wants is, well, maybe we should go to the grocery store, right? So she's basically cluing him in. And he says in Greek, what to me and to you, woman, my hour has not yet come. So if my son says to me, woman, I'm thinking there's something a little bit wrong here. It's weird.
Hmm.
But the mom is sufficiently clued in that she goes up to the wine steward and says, just do what he tells you. It's fine. And that's just, it strikes me as that's the way families function. And that's the way mothers deal with their children when their children are being on their Jesus plane. And like the mom knows, and it's all good. And the poor wine steward is like, where did this wine come from? With this odd line about normally people serve the good stuff first and then serve
Yeah.
the plonk later. Well, we have no indication that anybody did that in antiquity. This is kind of a terrible thing to do. But it's interesting in terms of culture. So here you have the caterers who know what's going on, but the guy in charge doesn't. So anybody who's worked in food services knows how that works too, where the lower paid people are actually the ones who know what's going on, and
Hmm.
sometimes the management, who might have gotten in because their dad runs the business, they have no clue. I think the whole thing is funny. It's laughable. It's joyous. Nobody runs out of anything because there's a fix that's there, and everybody celebrates. And everybody celebrates, not just the bride and groom, who we never actually meet. How
Yeah.
fabulous is that?
I love being able to see it anew through your eyes. That's a real blessing, is to have somebody else take a look at the text that you've grown up with and maybe has just sort of, I think I've heard it called the veil of familiarity. You've
Oh,
heard it
that's nice. I like that.
so many times that you don't quite see it for what it could be.
Well,
And I
it's
love
more
that
than that.
you,
I think for a number of my Christian friends, the Bible is very serious.
mm,
It's the Word of God, right? Then you have to drop your voice like to that Charlton Heston was the Word of God, and they're not used to seeing the humor. They're
mhm,
not used to seeing the laughter. They're not used to following puns. When Jesus talks with the Samaritan lady, that's language of flirtation.
mm.
I mean, it's not like they're going to go have a date, later on, right? But there is a kind of wedding at sorts when of Jesus then goes to her town and hangs out for a couple of days. So they miss the fun. They miss the joy of the text. Jews, we know how to read texts with joy. We know how to see texts that are funny. We know how to appreciate puns. We know how to see various aspects of a story rather than just seeing it as completely linear. And since we're dealing with texts, the New Testament, the Gospels that are coming out of the Jewish tradition, what we can do if we read like Jews is to recover some of the joy of the text, which has sort
Yeah.
of gotten washed out with all that. It's the word of God. Yeah, God can have a good laugh too.
I think we provide them for him many times.
I think that's probably right.
Where we live.
Oh, the kids are at it again. Yeah.
You have this, your epilogue is Breakfast with Jesus. First of all, that would be awesome. But
I would think
second,
so. And plus he's going to provide the food.
and the wine evidently from the previous story, but talk to me about the epilogue and what you hope people will take from that section.
It's a sense of you get a grand do-over.
Mm-hmm.
Peter really, really messed up, badly messed up. And he gets a do-over. He has a 3 denials in the Passion. He has a 3, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my sheep, take care of people. You get it fixed. You get Peter weirdly right before the breakfast. This is a very odd scene. And it's probably a replay of a scene of the calling of the disciples in Luke chapter 5. I think John has repositioned the story. Where, it's like, oh, it's Jesus on the beach. So what does he do? He jumps into the water, and it's not clear whether he's swimming towards shore or away from shore. But in a sense, it's kind of like a new baptism. I mean, and he goes in naked.
Yeah.
Right? So he's washed clean again, and then he gets to start again, and he starts with food. So when we have the end of the Gospel of Luke, we have a couple of meals. The one people most remember is the breaking of the bread on the road to Emmaus.
Mm-hmm.
This is another version of that. So John is a very sensual text. I mean, you feel the breeze. That's the Spirit blowing where it will. That's like a draft, or the air conditioning goes on. It's the Holy Spirit, particularly in the summertime if it's hot. You taste it. The taste of the wine, that really good wine on your tongue, and you can feel it. You can smell it, from Martha saying, Lord, there'll be a stink. Was it the King James language? He stinketh. It's a great line. To the smell of the perfume when Mary anoints Jesus' feet in the next chapter.
Filling the room.
Taste it. From the wine to take it to the, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, which is distasteful, but shockingly so, to this breakfast. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, you don't need like poached eggs with hollandaise sauce. Just some fish and some bread on a seashore. And
you can even smell them cooking over a fire.
You can smell it cooking. Hopefully somebody else has gutted the fish. I grew up in a fishing family. I know from this. Not my favorite part of fishing. But that next time you feel a draft, or you smell a smell, or you just taste something on your tongue, it's going to remind you of the gospel. And then what happens? You go back to the beginning. You go back to the initial call. You go back to that initial meal. It's breakfast. Well, the sun has just come up, and then there's light. And you start the day again, and you start creation again. And you go back home, and you do it better the next time. In the same way, I think John wants the text to be read and reread and reread. And each time you read it, there will be echoes of those later chapters that you're now hearing for the first time, because now you're going back and looking at chapter 1. But you've got everything up through chapter 21 in your head and on your tongue and in your ears and in your nasal passages. So John says, go back and do it again. Go back and do it again. Fix it if you need to fix something. See something different, because you've now got chapter 6 in your mind when you look at chapter 1, or chapter 20 in your mind when you look at chapter 2. So John's like this endless repository of riches.
Do you have a favorite gospel?
Usually the one I'm working on.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, there are favorite parts of each gospel
Yeah.
that I have, like the Last Supper discourses in John, right? Chapter 14 through chapter 17, where at one point he says, "Come, let us go hence." And then he talks on for another 2 chapters. And it's very repetitious. This stuff my theologian friends live for. I'm
Hmm.
like, can I have more narrative? It's like, I really like stories. And I like shorter stories rather than super long stories. And John, as they say in the South, bless his heart, does not know when to end a story. Right. So we've just had a healing of the guy by the pool and everything looks okay. And then it turns out to be the Sabbath and we're on for another 20 verses. Right. Please just end a story. So I like parables, and there are no parables in the Gospel of John. That's very frustrating. I like
Mm.
dialogue, and John gives me a lot of dialogue. Jesus and Nicodemus, Jesus and Martha at the tomb. What a great scene. Jesus and the Samaritan lady at the well. This kind of dialogue where you learn more and more about Jesus. And the thing is, one of the things with the Gospel of John is where you start is not where you end. So John sets you up brilliantly to think that things are going to go one way. And then it turns out they go in a completely different direction. So there's always surprise. And in that surprise, as readers, ideally, when we readers, see something and it's all kind of generic and conventional. And then whoop, suddenly everything's different. For me as a reader, there's a delight there. And then I have to go back and figure out, where did the break come in? What did I miss? Why didn't I know this was going to happen? And now that if I read it again, am I going to see clues there? Oh, AJ, I think, yeah, you should have seen that back in verse 3. And that's part of the genius of John's literature. Last Supper discourse is not so much.
So I'm wondering if whether in scripture between Old and New, as we call them, or commentary, Talmud, is there some gap or 100 years or some place where you think, why don't I have the book that's written about this? Is there some hole that you would love filled in history from Judaism up through all of this time period we're
So,
talking
like,
about?
I don't know, because that's asking me to speculate on what I don't have.
Ah, gotcha.
So do we have much about the Persian period from the time
Hmm.
of the return of the exiles from Babylon in 538 up to Alexander the Great in 333? And we got a couple of things: Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah. We don't have much.
Hmm.
Um, and we've got some Persian records, which are really interesting. Um, and my Persian linguistic skills in terms of Farsi and so on, they're not that good. So that's kind of an open period for me that I do think it would be nice to know more. We don't have anything directly from Jesus. So I have these imaginary conversations with Jesus, like, you said, what? What did you mean by that? Was that a misquote?
Yeah.
As we go from the Aramaic in which Jesus spoke to the oral tradition where everything gets mucked up because stuff gets mucked up by memory, to the Greek translation, then what happens if we're reading it in English or we're reading it in French or Swahili or Spanish or whatever. Um, and all translators are traders. So anytime you translate something gets added in that doesn't belong and something drops out that does belong, and you miss the puns.
Mm.
I think actually Jesus was a lot funnier than the Gospels does, because I think he's punning. And Semitic languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, and even Syriac, they play with the same root, but the same root means different things. And it's easier to pun in Semitic languages than it is to pun in Greek.
Interesting. AJ Levine, I want to sign up for your classes now that we've started to speak. I don't know how I'm going to feel about how I would feel about taking the tests because of the detail in which you. But
Oh no! I told my students when I was teaching, particularly when I was teaching at Vanderbilt, from which I retired in 2021. I told them the first day of class for the intro course that if I did not think they knew what they were doing, I would flunk them,
mm,
because it's my name on that transcript. And I cannot afford for them to go out and they're in a church and they misquote the text, or they say something stupid, or they say something offensive, and somebody were to say to them, "Who taught you New Testament?"
mm,
That's on me. So in the same way that if I were a medical doctor, I would not want to pass somebody just because I like the person, is a very friendly, a
right.
kind person. You really do need to know that this drug does not interact well with that drug. And therefore I want my students to be competent. and in fact, to be more than competent. So I would frequently say to students things like, you might want to think about a career in dentistry. It relieves pain. I love dentists. It relieves pain. You can get a cavity fixed. You get called doctor. You get to wear a nice coat, but you don't belong in the pulpit. Go find another profession. Mm. So those tests were actually really hard. But if they got through me, they should be able to have the confidence that when they get up in the pulpit, they actually know what they're doing.
Dr. H.A. Levine, I wish you the best. I wish you a good sleep tonight to get back on the U.S. time zones, and how generous you are to speak with me. Thank you.
A pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.